And good evening. I'm going to be talking tonight about something that I had a long time hesitated about, which is writing chaotic invitations. Now, for some of you, it might be seeming like a bit lame that we're even talking about invitations. So, why am I doing this? Is because after having done some analysis of all the data that we have, measuring with the periodic table that we do, all the coaching sessions and leaders, startups, coaches, we find actually there's a blind spot around how to actually do invitations that make sure that people arrive without wasting time or having these terribly boring meetings in online settings, which you all probably have experienced at least once. So that's what we're going to do. There's going to be a little bit of framing before. So before you invite, I'm going to go through a couple of things to do with the periodic table. And then if you're watching this tutorial and you just want to have those 6 different buckets, which I'll then add as a link below, actually in the comments, I'll add that. Then you can skip forward for this first bit and go straight to section 1, which you'll see on the video chapters. So what are we going to talk about is really about how to invite, and I'm talking about the process of invitation, not just the calendar invite. Even though I'm going to be showing you examples of Google Calendar invites, it's going to be more than the actual just moment of inviting. We'll be also talking about measuring flow. Those of you who haven't ever heard of flow, Mihali's positive psychology flow theory, I'll add a link, I think it's going to be up here, into the YouTube replay so you can watch the video where I go through in depth how to do that with your own team or with yourself. I'll basically explain the simplified way of measuring and hacking your flow with your level of competent skill, challenge, and motivation. And I'll show you today how to actually use that in the context of inviting people, how to make it that's flow inducing. And that's why we talk about not boring. So we'll go through that in a second. And then I'll also show you a little bit about chaotic. We talked about chaotic last week. Chaotic is a big topic. It's a huge blind spot. Most people don't even know the word chaotic, chaos and order imbalance. So if you've never heard of the term, I'll add a link up there as well about the basic theory of chaotic video, so I don't have to go through it today and I can go straight into this tutorial. Also going to talk about green, blue, red. If I use color coding, if I say talking green, blue, or red, that's what I'm referring to. It's going to be the framework from the periodic table of green, blue, red behaviors. It's nothing to do with the personality models, which some people ask me about. And again, if you haven't seen this basic video about order proportion of those 3 colors that anybody can use, it's really useful for you to think about when you're writing your invitations, your own text. So that's going to be for the framing today. And what we're focusing on is the meso level of conversations. Now, when we think about communication, it can be really easy to get lost in all the different levels of communication. There is a micro level, a meso level, macro, and mundo. Now, mundo is basically social media. So inviting in social media is a completely different ballgame. I'm not going to cover that today. It's about thinking like, the social media invites like this one to this webinar or to this tutorial video. Macro is at your organizational level. So that could be your official internal communications, HR communications to a mass of people. Meso is you and your team. So this is daily operations. If you're in a startup, it's your co-founder team. Micro is actually in your head. It's the communication you have with yourself about other people, which is hugely important. So for today, I'm focusing this particular tutorial on how to actually do chaotic invitations for the meso level with all the examples. But of course, you can apply this logic to others yourself. So what are we going to talk about is how to start. Now, this is almost lame. It's so basic, but it's worth measuring a little bit. This is data that I'm using from our measure dashboard. It's too small for you just to read the details. Don't worry about that. It's really just showing you that out of all the different groups of people that we measure, 8 is the amount of chaos out of 10. There's 8 out of 10 in average chaos in communication with all the people we measure, which is a lot. Now, there's more or less chaos depending on the roles. The big takeaway from this particular thing is that both a lot of time and way too much time is being wasted because of poor communication. Over 50% of communication touch points is said by people reporting that they're wasting time. So it's a big issue, particularly when we don't feel that we often have that much time in the day. So lack of time. Second thing from here is This is now the actual flow data. If you haven't seen the flow video, watch that before, otherwise this is going to be too complex. But if I simplify flow to 4 different numbers, what you'll recognize here is Mihaly's octant model from 1988 that we flipped 45 degrees on the side. So the key takeaway here is that everybody's really motivated. That's the inner score. So generally people are motivated to reach flow, which is the prerequisite. What we're finding for today is that in terms of invitations, most people are in the comfort zone. This is the comfort zone, this is the stress zone, and this is the flow zone. Ideally, your meetings should be in a flow. Otherwise, you go into this either comfort zone or worse, boredom, which is why a lot of meetings are boring, or then the stress zone. If you're presenting and you have no idea what you're talking about, then you can get really stressed. So the idea is to try and hack the flow for everybody to use in meetings. And the way to do that is often by the way you set up the meeting. And the good news here is that if you can see, all the different teams are in the comfort zone in terms of communication in their meetings, which is probably a blind spot for many people who think they're stressed at work. So they think, obviously, there's this coming up. Actually, it's the exact opposite. There's room to challenge. Only 4 out of 10 challenge, which means that if people would start to challenge themselves in the way they engage in the communication in meetings, there's lots of ways of doing that other than just the invitation setup, they will probably reach flow. So there's a huge potential, there's an untapped potential for flow in meetings, which is why I titled this The End of Boring and Inefficient Meetings, because most people find it boring because they're in the comfort zone. So this is data. If you want your own data, measure your own flow in your meetings, you can reach out to us on our website. We'll actually do these measures for teams and individuals. So, but without looking too much at data, in a template version, if I were to template an invitation, most people just send the Google Cal with the time. That is not enough. How many times have you ever been to a meeting where you thought it was this time, the other one thought it was another time because you're in a different time zone? Simple workaround in the title, just put the flag with the time for the different countries. So you've acknowledged, it gives you a double check loop that your time in the calendar is what you intended. Now, often what happens is that then when you do this exercise, this is a template that I use for the countries that in Green Elephant we work with most often. So Japan, for example, I have a little flag for Japan. And I know that when I send an invite to somebody who's in Japan or a remote team that's spanning different countries, I'm going to actually make the effort of taking those 30 extra seconds and thinking, if it's 5 o'clock Finnish time, it's 4 o'clock French time or Dutch time. And that in the title of the invitation means that I know that if my calendar is not aligned with that time because I messed up with my time zone by traveling, for example, at least I have that extra feedback loop. Often this avoids people turning up at the wrong time, I found. So that's one thing. Just add your flags in the beginning. Very easy. And the other thing is duration. Don't have a meeting that's just like endless time because you're trying to keep too much reservation. Generally, because of this flow that we talked about before, meetings are too long. So if you're short of time, if you're a startup watching this, if you're short of time, try and down all the number of meeting time schedules. Try and reduce the duration of your average meetings. If you're used to doing 1 hour, try and do 30 minutes. If you're used to doing 30 minutes, try 20. Just test it out and see, so that you actually increase the flow by increasing the level of challenge. So very simple. This is the obvious bit. And when it could look something like this. If you're sending an invitation out, you'd have the invitation for a particular solving of a particular problem at this time with the 2 different country flags, and then a duration here. I've put an hour. Then at least it's bulletproof. When you're sending it, you look at your own calendar, whether it's Google or another calendar, you get this feedback loop. And welcome Gylo, welcome Michelle, welcome Anu. I can see you in the chat. And basically, we're going to be going through each one of those steps. So if there's anything that you haven't ever done when you do invitations, do ping it in the chat. I'd be curious to see which ones you've never actually used before. This is probably the standard one. So I'll jump to number 2. Where is the meeting now? Obviously online, face-to-face. Most people say they prefer face-to-face, and they're much more present. There's a lot of absencing online, people hiding behind a screen that's not showing their camera. So when you have a choice, obviously online, a lot of people tell you they prefer, but in actual everyday life, plus in our trying to save energy and travel costs, it's a good idea to try and figure out how to go online. Now, most people go online thinking everybody uses channels exactly the same way. This is a chart I used to use when working in Finland with people who are developers and working with developers who work across business boundaries of other clients. They all were messing up the fact that my channel is the same as your channel. So if we're talking about being green in your behavior, it means, first of all, check in before you send an invite. What is the channel to send the invite in? Not everybody uses email every day. So this is a checklist I had done for people to think like, okay, what's the best channel to schedule a meeting? Is it email? Is it a WhatsApp ping with the invitation in the link? Is it a phone call and say, hi, Michelle, can we have a meeting tomorrow? Is that cool at that time? And none of them are better or worse. It's just about adapting to the person. So if you don't do that before, then obviously you're sending a message in an email through your automatic calendar invite that nobody's going to necessarily pick up on time. So it's worth checking, particularly those categories. How do you make sure you notify people of changes? Where do you give feedback about the invitation? How do you tackle urgence? And where and how do you share notes or files? Now, the good news is a lot of tools nowadays are doing more and more of these things. Calendly, Google, plenty of tools are starting to automate all these things. So that's getting easier and easier. Now, if we take this as a template, a simple way of doing this is just adding a link. Now, it could be a link to a Zoom if you're having Zoom or Google Teams or Hangouts, whatever you're using. But having a clear link in multiple places is usually a good idea. And at the moment, I'm quite liking Calendly. I've been testing Calendly. I'm not paid by them, by the way, to actually talk about Calendly. But what they've done is, if you're a startup, this is a particularly useful tool for the whole process of scheduling and canceling and managing the reminders in different channels. They've nailed it with SMS plus email. So it's worth looking into for that whole where and when part. So, but it's not enough. You still have to add other bits to it for it to be a chaotic invitation. Third, this is where it starts to get juicy and interesting. Like, why? Why should you turn up? This is where most people are flipping it the wrong way. They're thinking, oh, we have to go, or it's obvious why we should have this meeting. And that is often the big blind spot. So little zoom out. This is an infographic I made a few years ago about the stages of client relation in B2B business. Now, there's different moments with different things happening at different stages of relationship. So if you're building a rapport with people and that you're meeting regularly, you're going to have a different invitation when it's the first meeting than when it's the very first date or, work engagement, and then starting to engage in deeper work. There might even be a point where there's a wake-up call where something bad happens and you have to adjust, and that's when the team really starts to form. Stage 2, team dynamics start to evolve. So I had initially jotted this down to myself, and most people were asking me to send them as a cheat sheet. So I made this an infographic. But if we take the first one, these are the 5 questions that people are often thinking about but not voicing before they turn up, which actually is pretty useful to have in the top of mind. Like, they're thinking, who are these people if they've never met you? Like, introductions is usually why they start from introductions in the meeting, but that if you can preempt that in the invitation a little bit, that can help. People can do their due diligence and background research before turning up to a meeting if you give them the chance to do so. The other thing is they might be wondering, do they really understand about me and my needs? They often come in with that fear. So that's another thing you can address. So these are really useful little prompts for you to think of being green, hence the background color. How do you put yourself in the shoes empathically of the person opposite? And their mindset is, can I trust this person? What's their added value, or what's the added value of me joining that meeting, prioritizing that over another meeting that I might have, or conflicting other requirements that I have? So worth being green when you're writing the why bit of your meeting. The other thing to mention is we're measuring what are the basic communication needs that people have. Now, as you can see, the biggest need over all the different roles is a need for autonomy. Now, when you send in a meeting invite with very little content, what happens is that people have very little autonomy because they feel that they have to follow the chaos of that meeting. So the more you can structure why you're meeting, what you're doing in the meeting and everything, the more you can autonomize people's participation both before and during the meeting. Also, another important topic that's often forgotten is the goals of a meeting. People often just forget that there is collective goals, not just individual goals. So a couple of thoughts there. As a template, this is the simplest that I could come up with. This is actually what I use now on my internal meetings literally every day. Why are we meeting? I put a thumbs icon just to remind us that this is about the reasons why we've agreed to join this, and also it can be things that we might need to agree on as objectives before we start. Objectives, it could be a list of objectives, like here are the 3 objectives. It could be a list of goals, collective goals. It could be the questions that you're trying to answer if it's a creative meeting. Or it could just be criteria if you're having a discussion, a scientific debate that you're using for that. Any other limitations to your meeting probably would be worth having as bullet points so that people turn up with this calibration, what we call the framing of a meeting. Now, little anecdote, in France, a manager is called a cadre, which is a frame. Reason for that is that it's the job of the manager. Typically in France, the traditional organization setups is the manager who invites the meeting. It's their job to frame what is inside the box of that meeting, and therefore also what is not. So this is about framing the box of the meeting so that we're not talking about this, we are talking about that. So that's what your why level is about. This is the first big blind spot. In a previous video last week, I streamed with a startup called Silent Games, where they were looking at chaotic roles. What on earth is a chaotic role? It's a role that you take with regards to the group. This is where you can hack your flow. If you're bored, it's most likely because people are all turning up as participants or experts to a meeting. Nobody's hosting. I'll show you in a second some data to show that there is almost zero hosting in most meetings. It's left unknown and unstructured, and therefore chaotic, and therefore waste of time. So a chaotic role is a role that you can take on top of your normal expertise role. So if you're the manager or UX designer or developer, doesn't matter. You can still take one of those roles and add it like a hat, which is why we think of them as chaotic hats or roles. These hats are things that you can do to add a level of challenge. This is easier than that, which is in turn easier than this, and so on. Steward is got nothing to do with the medieval term. This is a modern term used a lot in teal organizations. So I'm not going to go through these details. I'm going to do a separate video on the chaotic roles if you're interested. I'll add that again to the top later. But what's important here is to just specify who's hosting and harvesting. Just that, so that you manage people's expectations without them turning up thinking, we'll figure it out over there. And then nobody comes prepared, and those who have to present wait way too long. So now this is the measure of chaotic roles in the majority of places. As you can see, most people are participants, experts, or guests. Now, this is harvester, host, and steward. Here, it seems that quite a few people are doing stewardship, but if I look at the yellow is coaches. It's quite alarming that a lot of coaches just don't host their meetings. In a way, they should be the ones hosting the best. So a bit of blind spot. If you're a coach watching this, make sure you're hosting your meetings, particularly if you're trying to get paid. Less chaos. Then this is where it gets interesting. If I measure the same 2 roles, host and harvester, without putting them in the context of the other question as a control question, you'll notice that overall the 2 roles that most people never take, or take least out of all, are those 2 roles that make the meeting work, host and harvester. You have 30.3 and 29.6 as aggregate scores for those 2. So that tells me that as a group of people, we generally have a lot more effort to make on hosting and harvesting meetings. So in a template, that means just simply specifying. What does it mean? Who's joining? Just a simple bucket. Who's joining? Managing their expectations so that we can efficiently tap into our collective intelligence. Here are the suggested roles for this meeting. And then you voice it, like for this is my internal template. So Anul's usually hosting and steward. So I would put Anul, host and steward. Estève, harvester and steward. I'm usually the one pressing the button to record. It could be somebody else joins as an expertise. Now, here, this is the dry, I would say, northern minimalistic approach to a very pragmatic approach. It's a bit cold. But if you want to make this friendly and build trust, I've built a lot of micro habits for leaders, particularly in the gaming companies like Ubisoft, where they've actually started building an invitation where they expand this and take it to a praise. So a positive phrase about each person. Why Mari is joining with her expertise in accounting is because maybe her irreplaceable, very useful expertise in accounting gives her a little pat on the back, and then she feels more willing to join, more positively acknowledged, not just by the person inviting, but everybody sees that in the invitation. So she knows that everybody recognizes her expertise. It's a tiny little detail which can make a huge difference, because somebody might say, hey, I'm actually not an expert in what you thought, so don't invite me. And there was a meeting once I saw where people had this rule where if your role is not matching what was said in the invitation, you're allowed to decline. Or if you don't have a role in the meeting, you're allowed to decline the meeting. Otherwise, it could waste time. That's quite excessive, quite extreme, but there's 6 in total. So this is a bit of data about levels of conversation. Now, if you've never heard about Otto Scharmer's work in MIT and Presencing Institute, check him out. It's really interesting. This is a summary of his work on theory U and the different levels of conversation. Most people don't realize that discussion and dialogue and co-creation are very different things. So you all know small talk. Usually you don't invite small talk. It's like, let's just meet up for a coffee. That's it. Time, place, gone. So usually you start to need invitations when you're wanting a level 2 conversation. This is deeper and deeper into the collective intelligence. In a way, if I put it really simply, Otto Scharmer's postulate is that we should be tapping into those level 3 and 4 way more. And a lot of it is down to the way we invite those. We don't necessarily speak in the invitation of, are we going for a debate, a discussion, a dialogue, a co-creation, a brainstorm? These different levels have different emotional locks or barriers. For example, if you think of the first barrier, I'm going to go back. There it is. The first barrier, you have to go through the judgment barrier before you can go to proper discussion. And then you have to go through the cynicism barrier before you go to dialogue. And then the fear barrier before you go to co-creation. Now, if you don't address those in your invitation in some way or through the rules, as we'll see in a minute, then you can expect people to stay on the level of mediocre small talk and possibly frictional discussion. So the quality of your invitation is going to be really important. Now, here I put a little reminder for myself to doodle this for you, because I'll do another video on deep diving on how to do chaotic processes. Basically, it's not that complicated. Every meeting has a very similar human dynamic. If you put the timeline, there's always a first, what we call divergent stage to any meeting. So you open your thinking. Your thinking gets wider. So you open with, for example, why questions, what. You open up presentations, new topics, new important things. And then you get into this area, which is like what they call the groan zone, which is where the chaos reigns and it gets creative. And that can be any time you want. And then at some point, you start to close the conversation. And that's what we call convergent. Now, pretty much every single conversation will follow that pattern. The only question is how many steps and how long are they going to be? So if you're hosting a meeting and you're inviting a meeting, voicing what are those steps is way more important than the topics you cover. That's the secret recipe. So if you have 8 steps, it could be that, the first one is a check-in or framing, and then a check-in, and then you might do a presentation 1, presentation 2, then you have a bit of a brainstorm, then you have a dialogue, then you have a discussion, then you make decisions, and then you do a checkout. Those are all, notice, steps of process. They're nothing to do with the topics. You could even copy-paste that from one meeting to the next. Generally, people forget that this needs opening and closing, and therefore they jump straight into the discussion without warming up the collective intelligence, which generates even more chaos naturally. So if I now go back to these slides, this is a detailed hand version that I'm now harvesting for myself. When I've got this nailed, I'll do a proper video on it and open up the actual steps like this. I call these algorithms, meeting algorithms. It's a bit like a recipe that takes you from A to B for a host to navigate the process. So that's something to bear in mind when you're doing a template for what are we going to do. So agendas. Most people think of an agenda, and I even this morning, I went to a meeting where I'm coaching somebody who's paying a lot of attention to the chaotic. And he sent me a meeting invitation because I had noticed last time that he didn't have any invitation content. It was just a time. So he sort of got, okay, I'm going to send you a proper meeting invitation. What did he do? He sent me a huge long line of text of basically the topics of the meeting. Now, that is not a chaotic invitation. That is a list of topics. It's very useful. It helped me prepare for the meeting. Thank you. But it doesn't help us to break down the time between step 1 and step 2, because in fact, what happened is that we ran out of time naturally. So a chaotic invitation, this is the really the core of it, is to have a step with a time budget. It could be a presentation, and then the person who's involved so that they can prepare. So what I wrote in the template is, first, all to come prepared. Here is a suggested way of using our collective focus. Notice that it's suggested, not imposed. It gives people a chance to counter propose something better. But in my experience, that's the minimum viable way of doing an agenda. You can take any steps you want, as I drew. You have divergent steps, the framing and checking and presentation, the brainstorm, which is the groan zone, the discussion ending the groan zone, starting to close with the decisions, and then you check out. I always have a framing, a checkout, and a check-in, because those literally help people to open their thinking and close their thinking. So I always have a check-in question, what are your needs, for example, and a checkout question. And so in that template, it's really easy. I just need to take the middle bits and type them for each meeting. Notice that I put also the time per person for the host. So when you do a check-in and you say, what are your needs? Expect some people to speak for 5 minutes, they're thinking out loud, and others to talk 20 seconds. To avoid that problem, you can give them a 1-minute prep. So you say, it's going to be 1 minute per person, and I will interrupt you, hint, hint, so that you don't end up having people hogging the whole meeting because they just like the sound of their own voice. So it's very hard for you to do that interruption if you haven't made it upfront clear, because who are you to interrupt to? If you're not the host, you haven't given them an agenda, the person who likes to talk will talk. So that helps you also kindly and empathically interrupt people when they're not acting in the collective intelligence and therefore wasting time. It also allows you to increase the flow by offering people who are usually bored, if they've been bored for 5 meetings in a row and you know that they're just multitasking, they've screen cameras off, they're phoning other people, texting other people, and doing Google research on the side, they're bored. So instead of letting them get on with their boredom and multitasking and giving half focus and being absent, you can also up the challenge by asking them to help host or harvest the meeting. And that's where you show recognition. Anne was hosting today. Thank you, Anne. It's sort of a way of giving that feedback loop to people about both flow and who's really helping the collective intelligence. So that's the what level. Now, I will be doing a summary of all of these in one single text at the end. The how is again another invisible one. This data shows the barriers of communication. If this is the traditional 1960 model of communication: message sent, message received, and there's 5 barriers to cross. The consciousness barrier, the permission barrier, the sensorial barrier, the language barrier, and the tangibility barrier. And most people see one of those as being the main reason that they can't communicate, but you have to cross all 5. It's a miracle that people understand each other. The one that's the lowest overall is the second one, which is the permission barrier. That means that in general, people don't allow themselves to speak enough in meetings. Even though there will be a few who hog the attention, the pattern is that people are not giving themselves permission enough. So how do you counter that? Well, one is to give value rules. Startups are really good at usually doing this. Instead of creating a set of rules, which are completely arbitrary, you start from creating your company's DNA values. So, for example, if trust is your company value, we believe in trust, we're a trustworthy company. What does it mean in behavior? That's the rule. So value plus rule, value rules. It's basically in behavior, that could mean you implicitly have permission to ask for help, to build trust. Now, these are just examples that we've harvested in different companies we've worked in where they have had successful value rules. Those are the kind of things that you can bring in very, very lightly with one sentence introduction into the meeting. this is another example. Some of you have heard about, the right to show approval, or the yes and instead of yes but rule. That's very common in creative world, to show the value of creativity. Thumbs voting for decision making, very useful as well. I can go through these in a separate video, but value rules are basically something that are often not shared. So therefore, when you start a meeting and there's a rule, people often get a bit put aback. Said, "Oh, why is there a rule here? I don't particularly like rules. Nobody likes rules." But the rules, as you've seen in the chaotic video, is really one of the main conditions to mitigate chaos. Is that if you don't have shared rules, like think of a game of football, if everybody played by their own rules, it would get very, very frictional. It's already frictional enough as it is. So adding those rules and some of these basic level things is also the first rule. Is how do you confirm? You send a meeting. I have a meeting, for example, tomorrow, where I have zero idea of who's turning up. It's a bit hard to host where you could host for 20 people or one. So people just either don't bother or forget to just send RSVP, I am coming to this. So a good thing to send in an invitation is to put not just the link, which everybody does, here's the join link, or the address if it's a face-to-face, not just the passcode, which of course you would need if it's a Zoom, but the actual confirmation date. Because like if I'm doing a meeting in 3 days and I need to prepare something, if I don't know by a certain date, I can't accuse people of not answering if I haven't given them the instruction to do so. So this is just about me being conscious and intentional and saying, please answer by this day. Now they might not, but at least I get a few more people clicking on register or I'm going. So that's something that's often forgotten in meetings, invitations, and then the online etiquette. So this is either the value rules you could be using, as I showed you before, but you could also use a simple, if you Google Zoom etiquette, you'll find gazillion photos of other people's best rules that they use for online meetings. Generally goes around, put your camera on, make sure your tech is set up, turn up early, be respectful of the host, and please mute yourself when you're not talking, those kind of things. Very simple. Why not put them in the invitation so you don't have to waste time at the beginning? You can just frame the meeting by saying, by the way, as you've seen in the invitation, if you haven't, check it out now. We're going to be using these basic rules and etiquette. Does anybody have any questions about them, or can we move on to the framing and the check-in? Boom, you've taken 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Instead of waffling on and having small talk about rules and disagreeing, again, you can save time by using those up front. So those are 6 steps that you can use to put as buckets, which are really, really detailed and practical level things that we found in conscious communication helps meetings be fluid online. When I will upload this video in YouTube as a replay, I will take this is an example that I made from Google Calendar. I will take this exact template with those buckets of when you're meeting, where you're meeting, the why, which is that intention setting with the bullet points of process, elements that frame the roles, why people are turning up with a bit of praise, an agenda, and what I call the algorithm. So in other words, most important is the time budget and who's doing what so that they can prepare. And then the RSVP, return, give a click, what it is that you want them to do, the call to action, if you like, before the meeting starts. And that is the actual full text that you can't read, but I'll put into the description of the video. So you can literally copy paste that, tweak it to your own liking. That's the one I use when I create a calendar invite. I just copy paste that, put it in the Google Cal, change the text, and in a few minutes, I've got a much, much better invitation that sets the thing off before we even start the meeting. Are there any questions about this from the chat? I've been running through this very quickly without giving you a chance to even pop questions in there. If you do, now's a good chance. Meanwhile, there will be a lot more content coming on a weekly basis around this. If you liked what we are doing, please do hit that subscribe button. We are replaying all the streams every week. So if you subscribe, you get those notifications coming first. And meanwhile, I wish you a very chaotic next meeting, hoping that your meetings will be less boring and more efficient. Bye for now.